You're watching a segment on the brutal Israeli assault on Gaza as the Palestinian death toll mounts. The anchor mentions they have a guest or an analyst to discuss the loss of Palestinian civilian life. Who are you expecting to see? Are you expecting to see a human rights lawyer, a UN worker, maybe an actual Palestinian? Or are you expecting this?
Joining us now is Israeli government spokesperson Ilan Levy.
Joining me now, Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus,
spokesman for the Israel Defense Forces.
I've been speaking to the Israeli government spokesperson, Mark Regev.
Joining me now is Shahar Azani, former Israeli diplomat and spokesperson for the Israeli consulate.
We are now joined by Ophir Falk. He's a foreign policy advisor to Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
A key feature of Western reporting on Palestinians is who is allowed to tell the story of Palestinians, both the history of the occupation as well as real-time atrocities being committed by the Israeli state. Welcome to the Occupation Style Guide, a series that looks at how we talk about, the things we talk about, and the words we use. Reporting is as much about who is telling the story as much as it is about the what, where, and when of it all. What we find again and again with the reporting on the Israeli occupation of Palestinians and the recent Israeli campaign of genocide in Gaza is that the sources used to comment on, analyze, and discuss things are rarely Palestinians themselves. Instead, we find that time and time again, it's Israeli voices, specifically Israeli government and military voices, and voices sympathetic to Israeli and American policies who are presented as authoritative and rational analysts in coverage. This is the case in the papers, and it's also the case in broadcast too.
If Hamas surrenders, the war can end tomorrow.
Nothing is beneath Hamas when it comes to cynicism and using children, elderly women, and humanitarian facilities in order to advance their military objectives.
You have to weigh that against the commitment of the Jewish state, the state of Israel, to always bring back prisoners.
Every day those hostages remain in Hamas captivity. Hamas is ultimately responsible for what happens to them.
On some of the other networks, the way they are reporting on information coming from the Hamas ministries as if they were credible, when we know Hamas is like ISIS or Al-Qaeda and can't be trusted.
This is not to say that we never see Palestinians or those who criticize Israeli policies in coverage, but these aren't voices and perspectives that lead coverage. In fact, they're nowhere near leading the coverage. According to a 2020 study done by Dr. Maha Nassar, less than 2% of the almost 2,500 opinion pieces about Palestinians in the New York Times written between 1970 and 2019 were by Palestinians. For the Washington Post during that same time period, only 1% of the over 3,000 opinion pieces about Palestinians were written by Palestinians. It's a pattern that we see throughout print, broadcast, and even audio. Palestinians featured in news coverage about themselves, their history, the atrocities their people are facing are exceptions, not the norm. And so what ends up happening is that both Israeli and American interests are upheld. Their aggression against the Palestinians is obscured, and any claims that Palestinians have, including just being able to be alive and safe, are at best dismissed and at worst used for justification for further violence against them. Take, for example, how the U.S. news media has spent months discussing the atmosphere on U.S. campuses and how pro-Israel students in particular have felt unsafe with chants for a, quote, free Palestine or for a ceasefire.
They were yelling, they were accusing them of apartheid, of ethnic cleansing, of genocide. And it was a really frightening experience.
Even while campuses were shutting down student groups, organizing demands for a ceasefire, while 3 Arab students were shot for wearing keffiyehs and speaking Arabic in public, while students were being threatened by billionaires and their own professors for advocating for Palestinians, the news coverage focused overwhelmingly on pro-Israel students' discomfort, who compared calls for a free Palestine to calls for genocide against Jewish people. Another example of how Western news media, especially U.S. news media, treats sources is the way it uses caveats. The Palestinian Ministry of Health's reports of the number of Palestinians killed in Gaza by Israeli bombs are undermined, purposely made questionable, by the inclusion of, quote, Hamas-run in front of the Palestinian Ministry of Health. The same reports that the U.S. State Department and the Israeli government use and consider accurate. Israeli sources rarely, if ever, have such caveats. Instead, they are presented in a matter-of-fact way as truth and rarely, if ever, questioned. And so you end up with something like weeks of unquestioning coverage of the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza being home to an underground Hamas command center.
Israel says Hamas has operated a command center under Al-Shifa hospital using civilians as human shields.
Those hospitals and so forth are places where Hamas keeps weapons and keeps its Hamas leadership, that they have their headquarters there.
When the reality was that there, in fact, wasn't.
This is a Guardian list where every terrorist writes his name and every terrorist has his own shift.
That was a calendar with days of the week on it. But as a result of that, Al-Shifa and every other hospital in Gaza became a legitimate target for the Israeli military because for weeks, Israeli officials and army spokespersons were allowed to say whatever they wanted without any pushback. Hospitals that were once lifelines for Palestinians became sites of their massacres. Who is used to tell or speak on a story, especially the Palestinian story, is fundamental to our understanding of the history of and claims by the Palestinians. It is also fundamental to our understanding of the Israeli occupation, apartheid, and the current campaign of genocide. And the news industry, especially here in the United States, has made it clear who is and isn't allowed to tell it.